spent about 2 days preparing this how-to video for you. Our budget was about $6 for batteries and a cassette, so don't expect Jurassic Park. The Ohio Frog and Toad Call Survey was sponsored by the Ohio Biological Survey and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Wildlife. You may wish to have your packets handy in front of you in case you wish to highlight anything that you feel necessary. If you have misplaced these handouts, please contact us for replacements.
Call survey video, how-to videotape. My name is Scott Minzy. I'm one of the co-coordinators of the project. Jeff Davis is the other co-coordinator. He's behind the camera. The purpose of this survey is to get an idea of what the status of frogs and toads is in Ohio. We'll take the data from this survey, which hopefully will continue for many years in the future, and we'll compare it to past data and future data to get an idea of the status of frogs and toads in Ohio. If you choose to do the survey, you will choose a county which you wish to work in, and we will randomly select a township for you to work in. We will then send you a map which looks something like this, with your township in it. We have chosen Butler County, Riley Township, to use as an example during the videotape. The first thing you need to do is set up your call route. The first thing you need to do is set up your call route, which you will survey 4 times during the spring and summer. The call route is set up about a week before the call survey actually begins. So you will start the survey in the middle of March, so about a week before that, you will set up your call route.
Con.
The call route will be set up during the day, and you'll need to take several things with you when you go out in your car to set up the route. First thing you need is a map of your area. Here we have Butler County.
All right.
The second thing you need is this blue sheet labeled Index of Site Descriptive Terms.
Okay. Okay.
The next thing is the green sheet, which is the Site Description Form.
Okay. Rolling.
You also need this packet, the Ohio Frog Calling Survey, which gives the step-by-step instructions of how to set up the route. And finally, you'll need a highlighter and a pen.
In a rural area is our starting point. We've located this intersection on our map, and when we stop at this stop sign, we're going to set the odometer in the car to 0. This is our starting point. We're setting the odometer back to 0.
Next, we're going to make an X on our map where the starting point is. And then from here on out, we will trace our route with the highlighter. Next, we take out the green sheet and we need to fill out the starting information. We will assign you a route number. This is in Butler County, Riley Township. The next line asks for the starting site. On our map, this is Peoria, Riley Road at Springfield Road. That's our starting site. We will now proceed to our first breeding site, what we think will be a breeding site. We come to our first breeding site, or potential breeding site. I'm going to mark a number 1 on the map where this site is approximately located. Then we're going to look at the odometer.
We've only gone 0.2 of a mile since our initial point.
So our first site is 0.2 of a mile from our initial starting point. The road name, when we look on the map, this is Springfield Road. So the road name, put Springfield. Wait.
Yeah. All right.
The nearest intersection was Peoria Riley Road, and it's approximately 0.2 of a mile northwest of that intersection. As we will see in a few seconds, this is an ephemeral pond.
If you don't know exactly what site it is, you pull out the blue sheet. We would like you to use all these terms. Please don't make up your own so that we can be consistent throughout the whole survey. If we look down here, ephemeral pond, a temporary depression that fills with water for extended periods of time, usually during late winter and spring. As you can see, this pond is close to the road. We turned on our flashers for traffic. And as you can also see, this pond is close to a house. Make sure that you ask permission to do the survey when it's on somebody's property.
You'll recall that we only traveled 0.2 miles to this site. Since the next site has to be at least a half a mile away, we can't record any breeding site until we get to 0.7. Okay, as you see the highlight, we've turned down this road. We're not following any set pattern, we're just randomly choosing roads. And we found another possible breeding spot. And we're going to mark this with a number 2 because it's our second spot. Now we'll look at the mileage. The odometer now reads 2.7 miles. And that would be 2.7 miles from the beginning site that we marked as 0. Okay, so we're 2.7 miles from the starting point. This is Indian Creek Road, and we're about 3/10 of a mile north of Springfield Road. Now we're going to look at the breeding site, and we'll pull out the blue sheet again, and we're going to see that this is a creek. So we'll mark down creek, and since we know the name of the creek, we'll put Indian Creek. Remember, we always think about safety, so we've put our flashers on and we're going to go across the road and have a look at the breeding site that we've selected.
As you can see, this breeding spot is once again within sight distance and easy walking distance of the road. We want to make sure we're close to the road. This breeding spot would be good for both species of toads, bullfrogs, green frogs, and possibly pickerel frogs. Also, when you're looking at creeks and rivers, don't pick riffle zones for your spot. You want to pick deep pools that are slow moving.
The odometer now reads 3.4 miles. You'll recall the last stop was 2.7, so we have exceeded the 0.5 miles that we need to include Indian Creek as another breeding site. So it's okay to select the same stream as long as you've moved more than a half a mile.
A third site, we'll mark it with 3, and then we pull out the green sheet again. As you recall, we're 3.4 miles from the starting point. This is still Indian Creek Road, and we'll estimate 1 mile north of Springfield Road. Or we could say that we're at the intersection of Indian Creek and Imhoff Road. And once again, it's a creek, and once again, it's Indian Creek.
One of the dangers to consider is when you get out of the car, there could be a dog, and obviously if this is at night, you're not going to see that dog coming. This section of this creek would be a good breeding site again for green frogs, bullfrogs, both toads, and in the right parts of the state, pickerel frogs. Particularly around shallow areas like behind this little peninsula would be a good place to check, and of course all along the shoreline. Don't pick riffle zones, you're going to be looking for pools. Although we don't require it, one of the things that might be helpful is to take some photographs of each site. It's also a good idea to take it from different angles and a couple of different views. The reason that we would like you to do this is because it may simply be a good way to index the places that we've seen. If you do decide to take pictures, we would like for you to submit copies of those to us. Scott Menzie and I'm Jeff Davis, we're writing a book on Ohio's frogs and toads, and we would give full credit to any photographer's pictures that appears in our book. And we are in desperate need of a lot of habitat pictures.
You will continue choosing breeding sites until you come up with 10. And you will have this green sheet completely filled out, and you'll have 10 sites selected on the map, numbered on the map. Remember that each site needs to be a half-mile apart, and don't be biased when you're selecting your sites by whether or not you hear frogs in the sites or not. You want to choose the first site that you come to. Once you have completed both of these, make 2 copies of the green sheet, 2 additional copies of the green sheet, and 2 additional copies of the map, and make sure you highlight each copy. You will then send those 2 copies to us at 1971 Crest Road, C-R-E-S-T, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45240. This route that you have selected is set in stone now, and hopefully you will continue surveying this for years to come. But if you do not choose to continue doing this, we will have additional copies of this site to give to somebody who might wish to pick it up. Talk about what. Okay, now that you have your call route set up, you need to do the survey. The survey is going to be done 4 times each year. We've set up certain sampling periods where we feel you have the best chance of finding the most frogs. The sampling periods we've set up are in the 3rd week of March, April, May, and June. Now, if you live in the southern part of Ohio, you might want to adjust that a little bit. Frogs in the south will breed sooner than frogs will in the north, so you might want to bump up the period a week or 2. Now, when should you do the sampling? The best time is in the evening when frogs are most active. It's good if it's raining, but not necessary, and it needs to be in the mid-50 degrees for each survey period. You need to take the directions, Ohio Frog Calling Survey. You need to take this data sheet, Calling Frog Survey data sheet. You need to take your map with your sites listed on it. You also should take your site description form. This also has should have the exact location of each of your sites. You also need to take everyone will be receiving a tape recorder that looks something like this. It might be a little bigger, and you will also be receiving a microphone that goes with it. So you need to take this with you and a blank tape, which you also will be receiving. Everyone should take a couple of flashlights. A thermometer. And a pen. If you're going to use a different tape recorder than the one we send you, because you don't like the one we have or you have another one, please make sure that you have one that takes a standard size tape and not a small tape. We would like for everyone to use a standard size tape, this size. If you have trouble seeing the map in the dark, it might be helpful to take along a small flashlight. This is what we used often when we go out looking for frogs. It's very helpful.
When you arrive at the site, you need to turn off your car. Probably also a good idea to turn on your flashers. The reason you're turning off the car is because any kind of background noise may disturb frogs and cause them to quit calling. Flashers, of course, are for safety purposes.
Before you begin your sampling period, you need to record a few things on the beginning of each tape. So you need to record the route number, the county that you're sampling, the township, the date that you're sampling, the time you're starting, and the weather conditions when you're starting. When you arrive at your first site, you need to record into the tape recorder the site number that you're at and the time that it is. Then you get out of the car, and once you get out of the car, get as close to the breeding site as possible. It's likely that all the frogs will stop chorusing, so you have to remain totally silent and wait for the frogs to begin chorusing again. This might take a few minutes. When they do begin chorusing, hit record and record them for 3 minutes. During that time, you must remain completely silent. Also during that time, you should take the air temperature with
thermometer, and if you can get close to the water, take a water temperature. If you're afraid of taking the water temperature when you go in the water to place it, is going to disturb the frogs. Wait till after the sampling period is done, and then place the thermometer in. For each site, you're going to record some data. Here we are at site number 1. Record the time, the air temperature, the water temperature if you can get it, and the sky conditions. Then you want to record the species that you heard calling. In your group, you need to confer with each other to make sure that you definitely have, everyone agrees which frogs you heard. So you would check it off, and then you need to decide at what level these frogs are chorusing at. If you only hear individual frogs chorusing and they're not overlapping, then you circle 1. If you hear several individuals and they're overlapping, but you can still count the number of individuals, you circle a 2. If there are too many frogs, they're overlapping, they're too numerous to count, you circle a 3. After you're done with that, you get back in your car and you proceed to the next site.
In all 4 surveys, in March, April, May, and June, you need to make copies, 2 copies of each data sheet. So you'll send 2 to us and keep 1 for your own records. You take the data sheets and the tapes and send them to us at the Ohio Frog and Toad Call Survey, care of me, Scott Menzie, 1971 Crest Road, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45240. We'll have that address written down for you in a second. We would also appreciate it if you could update us on how you are doing after each survey. If you could email us or write us a letter to tell us how you're doing, are you having any problems, what's not working, or what is working. We would be most appreciative of that. This will show pictures and descriptions of potential breeding sites that amphibians might be chorusing from. These sites, the descriptions, match the blue sheet that you should already have.
It's another example of a habitat that we would describe as a ditch. It's actually the old Miami-Erie Canal, very historical site that was used during the late 1800s for transportation throughout Ohio. Obviously this canal is man-made, but for our purposes we would consider this to be a flooded ditch. It's only about 8 to 10 feet wide and probably no more than 2 or 3 feet deep at this point. We visit this roadside ditch frequently during the spring and summer. It's common to have Fowler's toads, American toads, spring peepers, green frogs, all calling from this little roadside ditch. If it's a little bit deeper, a little more extensive, in the summer it also will have bullfrogs chorusing from it. This roadside flooded ditch has accumulated from about 1 day's worth of rain, heavy rain. We have seen ditches like this. This is about 4 feet wide, about 1 foot deep, and about 50 feet long. Ditches like this will have just about any Ohio frog species breeding in it. Expect to see bullfrogs, green frogs, especially expect in the early spring to see wood frogs or leopard frogs. You would expect all of the tree frogs like spring peepers, gray tree frogs. This is a really, really good habitat. Don't pass anything like this up.
Of a ditch or rut next to a road. As you can tell, this was just created by a car going through it, making a ditch. It fills up with water. This area is suitable. This little wet area is suitable for things like mountain chorus frogs, spring peepers, western chorus frogs, and both types of toads. All of those animals will breed in this ditch. This is a flooded agricultural field. A few more days of rain, actually probably 1 more day of good rain, and there will be much more water in here. Animals such as American toads, Fowler's toads, gray tree frogs, spring peepers, western chorus frogs will all breed in flooded agricultural fields. Here is in this type of area, we would expect to see both species of toads and probably all kinds of tree frogs such as spring peepers, western chorus frogs, gray tree frogs, and possibly cricket frogs, but that is doubtful.
country roads like this are not uncommon in southeastern Ohio. We would refer to this as an ephemeral pond, and we've seen green frogs breeding in these. Toads use them frequently as well. This little roadside pool would probably be suitable for spring peepers, for toads, mountain chorus frogs, possibly gray tree frogs. It's about 8 or 10 feet in diameter and about 6 inches deep. As long as it holds water long enough, there will be frogs breeding in it. We've also seen cricket frogs breed in ponds like this, or pools like this, as long as there is a stream, a permanent stream around, to give them a place to stay during the summer. This is Acton Lake at Houston Woods State Park. The water level's low right now for flood control reasons. During the winter and the early spring, they open the dam and lower the level of the lake. But as spring rains arise, this water level will continue to go up. And along mud flats like this, it would not be uncommon to find American toads coursing. I wouldn't expect to find tree frogs in something like this. Also, during the summer, green frogs and bullfrogs will chorus from the edges of this water. This backwater slough is also at Houston Woods State Park. I would expect to find the same kinds of frogs breeding here that I would in the main part of the lake.
This is a man-made pond. Oftentimes you get bullfrogs and green frogs, toads will often breed in these types of ponds. Maybe some tree frogs like gray tree frogs.
We'll hear cricket frogs coursing from this. Even though it's right along the edge of this road, you can hear them. Green frogs and bullfrogs also breed here. And it also could be expected to see toads breeding in a pond like this. Another example of a man-made pond. We're in southwestern Ohio still, and southwestern Ohio is rich in gravel resources. Consequently, we get to see a lot of frogs breeding in old gravel pits. A pond like this is in an area that has a lot of leopard frogs. There also are bullfrogs and green frogs that breed in here. The gravelly shores of this are excellent habitat for cricket frogs. Toads also will use this, both Fowlers and Americans. This is the Gilmore Ponds Wetland Interpretive Preserve in Butler County, Ohio. A lot of county park systems in the state have developed and preserved wetlands like this one. Although you can't see a lot of water right now, when the spring flooding rains come, there will be probably 30 or 40 acres of shallow, perhaps knee-deep water all across these fields. You can see some water out in the central portion right now. These are the absolute havens for Ohio's frogs and toads. Leopard frogs, pickerel frogs, gray tree frogs, probably all species of Ohio frogs will breed in places like this. This is the Great Miami River in southwestern Ohio. Other large rivers like this, the Coshocton, the Hocking, the Scioto, the Maumee, all can have frogs breeding in them. During the summer, along the shorelines, like on the opposite shore over there, you could expect to hear bullfrogs and green frogs chorusing. During the spring, you might expect to hear American toads or Fowler toad chorusing. Cricket frogs also breed in rivers like this. Other tree frogs, however, do not. Here at the Cincinnati Museum of Natural History's Frederick and Amy Geyer Research and Collections Center, we've decided to use preserved museum specimens along with some live specimens to demonstrate for you how to identify Ohio's frogs and toads. In addition to pointing out key characteristics, we'll be playing the advertisement calls of males so that you can associate that call with each species. The first species that we'll look at will be the first on the tape that was given to you this spring or fall at the Ohio Biological Survey workshop. This is the eastern spadefoot toad, Ohio's only endangered frog species. It is also the only member of the family Pelobatidae in Ohio. The scientific name for the spadefoot toad is Scaphiopus holbrookii. The quarter is in the picture so that you can have a size comparison. Eastern spadefoot toads are named for the sickle-shaped spade on the bottom of each foot. It's very proficient for digging. This is a species that seldom comes above the surface, only coming to the surface on warm, muggy nights to feed, and after 2 or 3 inch rainstorms to breed. This black spade is elongate, kind of sickle-shaped, and in comparison to the spades that you'll see on the bottom of an American toad, you'll notice that there's only one on each foot. American toads have one spade and also a tubercle on the opposite side of the foot. Other important characteristics for the spadefoot toad are rather indistinct parotid glands. They're so indistinct that it may be difficult to pick them up on the camera. I'm using this dissecting probe to point out or trace around the parotid gland at this time. American and Fowler toads also have bony crests on the top of their head. They're lacking on the spadefoot toad. Live specimens will have a yellowish lyre-shaped stripe down the back, and it's pale on this preserved specimen, but we can still trace along as it goes along here and here, so there's one on each side. This is the call of the eastern spadefoot toad. You'll notice that the undersides are rather smooth and they're free of any mottling or spotting. The dorsum has very small warts. If these frogs were alive and their eyes were open, you would find that they have vertically elliptical pupils. There are 2 species that are members of the family Bufonidae in Ohio. This one is the American toad, Bufo americanus. The other is the Fowler's toad, Bufo fowleri. That name has recently been changed from Bufo woodhousei fowleri. As I discuss the American toad and the Fowler's toad, I'll give hints on how to distinguish between the two, as they're very similar. If you look at the American toad's underside, you'll notice that it has a series of spots on its belly and chest. When we look at Fowler's toads, you'll notice that it's clear and kind of creamy colored. The only spot would be one single dark blotch about here on the sternum. Another important characteristic of the American toad is that the large cornified warts on the back number 1 or 2 in the black spots on the back. You'll notice here that there's a dark spot with 2 fused warts. There's a small one and a large one here. Here's a dark spot with only 1. Here again is a dark spot with 1. On a Fowler's toad, the warts won't be so large. Additionally, there will be 3 or more per dark spot on each leg. The knee is here. This is the heel. The tibia, this portion of the leg between the knee and the heel, has enlarged conical warts. On a Fowler's toad, these warts would not be so large. If we look at a larger specimen, you can see that the warts in the same place are even larger. However, on this dark specimen, they may not show up quite as well. Another important characteristic is to look for the parotid glands. These bean-shaped glands are the parotid glands located behind the eyes. The cranial crests are bony ridges on the skull. The cranial crests that occur between the eyes are called intraorbital crests. The bony crests that occur behind the eyes are called postorbital crests. On the American toad, the postorbital crest does not touch the parotid gland, or if it does, it will attach only by this very short spur. On a Fowler's toad, the parotid gland lays against the postorbital crest. This is the call of the American toad. The color variation of American toads can be pretty incredible. In southwest Ohio and Claremont County, we see bright red toads. In other parts, we see brown, we see gray, we even see yellow. We're going to show you some live American toads so that you can see some of those color variations. This reddish color toad is from Claremont County in southwest Ohio. Again, we can point out some of the key characteristics of this toad. You'll notice that there are only one or two black spot or warts, and each large black spot on the back has very prominent parotid glands. And you'll notice again that the cranial crests, particularly those post-orbital crests, touch the parotid gland only by a spur. This side of the parotid gland in the front does not lay up against the post-orbital crest. The mottling on the belly, another color pattern, kind of yellowish, not uncommon. The sound that you're hearing is the distress call that is typically given by males and females both when you pick them up. On this one you can see that the parotid gland is widely separated from the post-orbital crests, and again you can see these large cornified warts numbering only one or possibly two, in this case right here, on the back. And here's another look at the large conical warts on the tibia. If we look at this yellow individual's underside, you can see that there's some mottling on the chest, and I would also point out that this is a male, and I can tell that this is a male because of this black pigmentation that you see on the throat. And you'll notice that as he gives his distress call, see if we can get him to do it again, you can see that that kind of swells up. That's where his vocal pouch is located. Webbing between the toes of toads is not very extensive. They only go in the water during the reproductive season, so you can see that the webbing is not very extensive. The pupils are elliptical but horizontal as opposed to vertical like they are in the spadefoot toad. This also is an American toad, and you can see again the number of warts. The parotid glands are shaped a little bit differently, but again they do not touch the post-orbital crests. Large conical warts on the tibia, mottling on the underside. And one special thing that we would point out, you'll notice that this particular toad has an extra front left leg. It may appear right on your screen, but that's because he's upside down. And there has been a lot of concern about deformities among amphibians all across the country. This particular toad came from Ohio, probably from Pike County. If you encounter any deformed frogs in Ohio, we would suggest that you collect them, contact us, and we will contact the Department of Natural Resources, because all deformed frogs should probably be investigated to find out if there is a problem with groundwater supplies. This is a Fowler's toad, Bufo fowleri. If you look at the back of this toad, you'll notice that the dark spots don't have one or two warts like the American toad, but instead they have a larger number, 3 or more smaller kind of grainy warts. There are 4 small warts in this spot, 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 or possibly 5 in this one. This spot has 3. If we turn this Fowler's toad over, you'll notice that the underside is kind of creamy white, and there's only a dark blotch here on the sternum. This happens to be a female, we can tell, because it lacks any dark pigmentation on the throat. A close-up of the parotid glands on the Fowler's toad shows that at this point right here, it lays against the cranial crest. Now that's very difficult to see and probably will not show up on a camera. Here is the cranial crest. Here's the front edge of the parotid gland right up against it. It literally lies against it. It's not connected by a short spur. This is typical coloration for a Fowler's toad with the pale stripe down the back. Oftentimes, but not always, these dark spots starting here number 6 on each side of this light mid-dorsal stripe. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there's one here on this side. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This band down the side of the body oftentimes is distinguishable also in Fowler's toads, but it does occur in some American toads. It's not a good field characteristic. The best field characteristic is to count the number of warts and also look at the belly for this creamy white. This preserved Fowler's toad will let us take a better look at the size of some of these dark spots on the back with 4 warts. This one has 4 warts. This wart back here is very small and difficult to see. The warts on the tibia are small and grainy. They're not nearly as large as they were in the American toad. This particular individual is very large and has a little bit of mottling here, but for the most part his entire belly is clear, and as you can see, this is a male by the dark throat patch. I'm going to let you take a look at this and review some of the characteristics while we listen to the advertisement call of the male Fowler's toad. We're now going to take a look at the members of the tree frog family, Hylidae, from Ohio. Most of our tree frogs are small, not much larger than this. Identification can be difficult, but if you know the right characteristics to look for, identification can be simplified. The first tree frog that we'll look at is called Blanchard's cricket frog. Cricket frogs can be identified by a dark triangle between the eyes, and the triangle points backwards. It's difficult to see on a preserved specimen, oftentimes difficult to see on a live specimen. Another key characteristic about this small tree frog is the fact that its back has some distinctive warts. We don't see that on most of the other small tree frogs. This cricket frog, we can see another key characteristic, and that is from the corner of the eye to the angle of the jaw, there's a very pale stripe. It's present in all specimens. Another way to identify this frog, if you look at the back of its thigh, you'll see that there's a dark, jagged stripe. It doesn't have clearly defined edges. As a matter of fact, on the other leg, if we open it a little bit, you can see that it's actually even broken in one point. Next to the anus, there are these 2 small warts, oftentimes used in field guides as a defining characteristic, but it's seldom do I find that we need to use it. Another characteristic of this tree frog, which makes it confusing as a tree frog, is that the toe discs, which are what you typically think of when you think tree frog, the discs that attach to trees and bark and leaves and so forth, they're not even as wide as the toe tips. That's true for both the front and the back feet. It's still a member of the tree frog family. Those toe discs actually are not the key characteristic for the family Hylidae. It happens to be the way that cartilage is arranged in the fingers that allows their fingers to swivel. The belly is clear white. The only difference that we would see would be that if this were a male, they have a black throat pouch. This specimen, as well as this one, are both females. I don't have a male specimen to show you. The call of Acris crepitans blanchardi sounds as if someone were clicking 2 pebbles together. Both of these frogs are large adults. This is a gray tree frog. There are two gray tree frogs in Ohio, and they are virtually indistinguishable by looking at them. To distinguish between the two, you either have to look at the size of their red blood cells or hear them calling. You'll notice that the gray tree frog has this grayish color for which it's named. But the scientific name of this, Hyla versicolor, is given to it because it can also change to a brilliant green. Regardless of whether it is gray or green, the lichen-like pattern that you see on the back, the blotches that are a darker gray, are always present. Another important characteristic of both gray tree frogs are these flash spots on the insides of the thighs and also on the inside of the tibia. Their purpose, you'll notice that when the frog folds its legs, they disappear. But when the frog jumps, they quickly appear so that predators will see the yellow. Then when it lands, it disappears and blends in with the background. It's a larger tree frog than the other Ohio tree frogs. And also, if I can get it to pull on my fingers, you'll be able to see that it has pretty large toe discs. So it's relatively unmistakable from the other tree frogs. It has very long legs and typically kind of a toad-like body. Toad-like in the sense that it's kind of squat as it sits and perches. Bulging eyes are also characteristic. It's not a difficult frog to identify. Now, I mentioned earlier that the way that you distinguish between the two species is one way is by their call. This is the call of Hyla versicolor, the gray tree frog that occurs over most of the northern part of the state and along the eastern edge of the state. The belly of gray tree frogs, as you can see, is stark white. We're going to look at some other key characteristics on some preserved specimens. The first gray tree frog that I showed you was the common gray tree frog, Hyla versicolor. This is Cope's gray tree frog, Hyla chrysosceles. I'm going to play the call for it so that you can compare it to the other. You'll notice that it's much more harsh. We tend to find this frog more in southwestern Ohio and along the southern to south central edge of the state. If you look at these two frogs, you can see the toe discs, especially on this larger specimen, and I'd also point out that on the male you can see that it has the dark throat as opposed to the lighter throat on the female. An important characteristic for identifying this frog, although typically size is going to do the job, this particular specimen shows very well a light-colored rectangle or box under the eye. An important characteristic, especially if you were comparing it to other tree frogs that are gray in color from other parts of the country. Again, you can see that it has the mottled or the lichen-like pattern on the back. We see that again on this individual, and that seldom is the same. It's almost a fingerprint different on each individual frog. The larger one will let us notice that the skin texture is a little bit grainy, probably one of the reasons that this frog used to be called the tree toad. There are 3 tree frogs in Ohio, all in the same genus called Pseudacris, that are about the same size. On first glance, they may even appear to be the same species, but we're going to show you how to distinguish between the 3. 2 of them, the one on your left and the one on the right, occur pretty much statewide and actually are pretty common frogs. The one in the middle only appears in the south central and southeastern up to perhaps Youngstown along the eastern border of the state. You'll notice that their toe discs are very small, their ground color is the same, their habitats are even the same in some cases. We'll go through each one at a time. The first one that we'll discuss is probably the most common frog in the state, perhaps second to American toads and bullfrogs, possibly even green frogs, but my guess is that they're all probably equally ubiquitous. This is a spring peeper. It's one of the first frogs to begin chorusing in the spring. This is its call. Although broken, you can see that there is an X on the back. There's a little bit of a gap in the X right here. Sometimes it's complete, sometimes it's not, but it's distinctively an X. You'll also notice that there is a dark line running between the eyes. In this particular individual, it almost forms a slight triangle, but when we look at the triangle in some of the other members of the Pseudacrid group, this one has the smallest, and it typically appears only to be this line. This particular individual is a male. You can tell by the dark throat pouch. The belly is kind of creamy colored and clear, and they're so small I would be surprised if they'll show up very well. But the toe discs are only slightly wider than the toes. This is a frog that climbs more than cricket frogs, but it doesn't go up in the trees. It has a tendency to stay in low shrubby vegetation. This is the spring peeper, Pseudacris crucifer, named for the cross on its back. The next member of the genus Pseudacris is the western chorus frog, Pseudacris triceriata. Triceriata means 3 stripes, and if you look down the back of this frog, you'll see 1, 2, 3 stripes. Along the western border of the state, you may find more frequently than in the east that these stripes turn into just a series of dots, or rows of dots, but still there will be 3. Although so small it's difficult to see, particularly on a pickled specimen, there's a light stripe along the upper lip. You don't see that on the spring peeper. This happens to be a female. You can see that there's no dark throat pouch, and also her abdomen is very dark. It's distended with eggs. This frog was probably collected during the breeding season. The toe discs are about equal in size to those of the spring peeper. Against my finger, you may be able to see that it's just slightly wider than the tip of the toe. When chorusing, this is a very difficult species to find. They like to lay in submerged dead grass, and it has a tendency to be the same color as the frog, and with the vertical lines of the grass, it blends in very well with the stripes on the frog. They're nearly impossible to find. Sounding sort of like your thumbnail rubbing across the teeth of a comb is likened to the call of the western chorus frog. The third member of the genus Pseudacris that occurs in Ohio is the mountain chorus frog, Pseudacris brachyphona. Key characteristics for this species are a dark triangle between the eyes. Although this specimen is very dark, it's difficult to see it, but it may show up. Another important characteristic is the fact that on the upper lip there's a faint white line. Now, the lower jaw is white also, so I'm going to try to separate the lower jaw from the upper so that you can focus on the upper and can see that faint white line. It's pretty distinguishable in this specimen. The toe discs are about the same size as in the other two pseudacryds, perhaps a little bit larger. This frog also has a tendency to grow to be slightly larger than the other two members of the genus Pseudacrys. I have another specimen here that shows my favorite characteristic for this particular specimen. You can slightly see the dark triangle between the eyes, but you'll notice that on the back there is a line here and here. This line comes in, curves towards the middle, and then curves back off to the side down on the abdomen. The line on the opposite side does the same, forming a pair of reversed parentheses. Occasionally, in some specimens, these two lines will touch right here in the middle, forming a crude X. Now, if the X is there, it's easy to confuse with the spring peeper. However, on a spring peeper, the lines are typically a little more discernible. They're darker edged, and they don't have this kind of fuzzy outline. On first appearance, oftentimes when you catch this particular species, this little bit of a dark mask around the eyes, particularly the dark color of the tympanic membrane, gives the illusion that you've caught a very tiny wood frog. And they do occur in the same regions of the state, and they also breed in the same ponds. This particular individual is a male, indicated by the dark throat pouch. This larger individual is a female. So we have a female on the right, or on the right, and a male on the left. So this is the mountain chorus frog. And again, we'll line them up. These are the three members of the genus Pseudacrys that occur in Ohio: the spring peeper, the western chorus frog, and the mountain chorus frog. You've heard the call of the two chorus, or the two pseudacryds on the far left. This is the call, the advertisement call of the mountain chorus frog. The last family of frogs that we find in Ohio is the family Ranidae, the true frogs. They range in size from medium to very large. This is a bullfrog, Rana catesbiana. If we look at this frog in its comparison size for this quarter, probably something more meaningful. Obviously it's a large frog, and this is not truly a huge specimen. We'll put a spring peeper, which we just reviewed from the last family, Hylidae, next to it, and you'll see that an adult spring peeper easily fits onto the hand of the bullfrog. So we have good size diversity among Ohio frogs. The bullfrog is an easy frog to identify aside from its size. It's the only member of the family Ranidae which lacks a dorsolateral fold that would extend down the back like this on either side. Instead, the bullfrog has something that in some literature is referred to as a tympanic fold, which occurs here. The dorsolateral fold is completely absent, the only Ohio Ranid like that. It's highly aquatic, and you can see that the hind feet are strongly webbed. This is the species that is oftentimes pursued for frog legs. If you look at the venter of it, kind of creamy white, but oftentimes with some gray mottling on the throat. Sometimes that even occurs down onto the chest. Again, this is not truly a giant specimen. This is probably, many Ohio specimens are at least 1/3 again as large as this individual. Something else that's interesting about bullfrogs, when they're alive, the males are easily discernible from females because the male will, during the breeding season, will develop a bright yellow throat pouch. During the non-breeding season, the tympanic membrane, the eardrum of a frog, on a female is small, no larger than the eye. If I use these forceps as calipers, you can see the size of the eye is about equal to the size of the tympanic membrane. This is a male bullfrog. The eye is significantly smaller than the tympanic membrane. So when you compare the two together, it's easily distinguishable which is the male. The call of the bullfrog matches its size. It's deep and resonating and may carry for a half a mile. The throat pouches of bullfrogs are internal, so there's not a huge swelling when it choruses. We're going to take another look at this male bullfrog. A very good sexual dimorphism among bullfrogs and a lot of other Ohio frogs is the fact that during the breeding season, the thumb of an adult male becomes greatly enlarged. This assists in amplexus, the mating embrace, during the breeding season. And you can compare that thumb to the size of the other fingers, and it is obviously quite swollen. This is a green frog, Rhanoclamitans melanota. The green frog is one of the most widespread frogs in Ohio. This one happens to be a male. Just like with the bullfrog, you can see that the tympanic membrane is larger than the eye. It may not appear quite as big because the frog is significantly smaller. This is about a 3-inch individual. Key characteristics for the green frog. You can see it's got a lot of green coloration on its head that blends into this kind of bronzy brown color on the back. Don't always count on this. Sometimes they're entirely green, sometimes they're entirely bronze. The nominate species for this, Rhanoclamitans clamitans, occurs in the southern part of the United States and is entirely bronze, and its name is the bronze frog. The key characteristic for a green frog are these raised folds of skin called dorsolateral folds that occur along the back. You can see that there's also a tympanic fold back here, but unlike the bullfrog, this extends all the way to the groin. The way that I'm holding this frog, by immobilizing its hind legs, probably the best way to hold a live frog. It doesn't have anything to push off of so that it can jump out of my hands. It can wiggle and struggle, but I really have all of its leverage taken away. The venter of a green frog is stark white. And we're out of the breeding season right now, so it's not quite so brilliant, but you can see traces of the yellow on the throat. During the breeding season, this will be almost as yellow as a lemon, quite striking. The mating call of the male green frog sounds like a loose banjo string being plucked. Another highly aquatic ranid, you can see it has extensively webbed hind feet. This female green frog has tympanic membranes that are about the same size as the eye compared to the male that was the live specimen that we looked at. This light line along the upper jaw is typical. Notice that there's a little bit of mottling on the sides and also on the thighs. The key characteristics here, this is a green frog with dorsolateral folds that even show up quite well in a preserved specimen. And again, here's that clear belly. This one has a little bit of mottling on the underside, but for the most part the chest and belly are clear. One of the prettiest frogs in Ohio is the wood frog. It's found throughout the state except the till plains along the western edge of the state, and it occurs sporadically even there. This is a common frog throughout the southern and the eastern part of the state, especially in the unglaciated regions. Key characteristic for the wood frog is the dark mask that you see behind the eye. Regardless of the ground color of the adult, this one's kind of a bronzy pinkish color. We've seen some that are literally pink. Sometimes they're brown, sometimes they're tan, sometimes they're even kind of a grayish color. That mask is always present. You'll also notice that the dorsolateral folds of this frog extend down the back all the way to the anus. The underside is clear, but typically you'll see these two spots on the front of the forearm, light stripe along the upper eye. An easy frog to distinguish. This is not a frog that occurs in water except when it's breeding. This is a distress call that you're hearing. This is not the mating call. This is a woodland frog that's active at night, especially when it's rainy. It's also a frog that's active during cool temperatures. This is what its mating call sounds like. From a distance, that sounds like a flock of mallards quacking. We're going to get out a pickled specimen and put this live individual away. The grayish-brown coloration of this particular wood frog is not atypical throughout the state. Again, notice that the dorsolateral folds extend all the way to the anus across the groin. The brown patch behind the eye is quite evident. And that is, again, the key characteristic for identification of a wood frog. This is a good size adult. This is not a frog that approaches the size of a bullfrog, not even the size of a green frog. So what you have seen with the two specimens that I've shown you have been pretty typical in size. Notice that the webbing between the hind feet is not very extensive. You don't see webbing extending out close to the tips of the toes, and the reason for that is because this is a terrestrial species as opposed to an aquatic species. Earlier on the live specimen, I pointed out those dark patches on the front of the forearms, and you can see them again on this particular individual. This frog does not have a single vocal pouch, but instead this and the rest of the ranids that we'll look at have a pair of vocal pouches that on a male would occur here and on the opposite side. This is one of the two spotted ranids, or true frogs, that occurs in Ohio. This is the northern leopard frog, Ranipipiens. You'll notice that between these light folds of skin down the back, the dorsolateral folds, there are two more ridges of skin, kind of concealed by these dark spots. These spots that occur on the back can either be dark brown or black, and you'll notice that the general shape of them, although not necessarily round, they don't have corners. Instead, the ends are rounded or the entire spot is round. The reason I point this out is we're going to have to compare this to a pickerel frog, a species that is frequently mistaken for a leopard frog. Now, if we look at the underside, you'll notice that it's kind of immaculate white. There's no mottling whatsoever, and because this is a species that would develop double vocal pouches, it doesn't have a dark throat. This is a relatively large leopard frog for an Ohio specimen. This one came from Warren County in the southwestern part of the state. The dorsolateral folds are quite noticeable. They're very distinctive from the ground color of the frog. They're light in color. They're filled with slime-secreting glands. And you'll notice that instead of going all the way to the anus like they did on the green frog, they stop here on the groin. If you look closely at the spots of a leopard frog, you'll notice that there's a very faint, light-colored outline around each. It doesn't matter whether the spot is on the back or on the side. And this becomes an important characteristic in identifying from or distinguishing between the leopard frog and the pickerel frog. There's a white stripe on the upper lip as well. This is a species that's on decline throughout much of its range, so it's important that you record any leopard frogs that you see. A terrestrial species, notice that the webbing between the hind feet is not very extensive. And as with all of the paired vocal pouch ranids, there's a dark patch on the forearm just behind the upper edge of the throat. Males and females alike in all of the paired vocal pouch ranids have the same size tympanic membranes, so that is not a characteristic that you can look for to distinguish between males and females. We've assimilated this group of northern leopard frogs because frequently the variation in the spot pattern can be confusing to people trying to identify them. Now, all of the frogs that you've seen so far, the live one that I showed you was tan, and these were probably tan to some degree. However, their color has faded. It's not uncommon to find leopard frogs that are very bright lime green. The spot still will be dark. The dorsolateral folds will still be light. So it's a frog highly variable in color from tan to green. But also notice that the spots, which are very distinctive on this particular individual, have changed to joining and forming these long stripes on this particular individual. Even the stripes on the legs, when the legs are completely folded, this stripe will align with the stripe here, this stripe with this one, so that you get a very concealing pattern on the legs. But notice that on this one, which has the aberrant striping pattern from the fused spots, the stripes on the legs go along the length of the thigh instead of across like they do on this one. Another very typical leopard frog is shown on the right. While you look at these, I'm going to play the advertisement call of the male northern leopard frog. Notice that it sounds like two balloons being rubbed together, and also you'll hear some chuckling. All of the paired vocal sac ranids call from being underwater. For comparison's sake, we've placed this adult pickerel frog on the right next to an adult leopard frog. You'll recall that the leopard frog, Ranapippians, has rounded spots, and for comparison's sake, the adult pickerel frog, Ranapalustris, has spots that have angles on them, and you can see that particularly with this spot, with this spot. Now, the dorsolateral folds of both extend to the groin, making them difficult. They're both spotted frogs. So for people who have little experience in identifying these two frogs, especially with smaller specimens, they frequently mistake the two. Notice on the leopard frog that you have one, and then here you have a portion of a center row of spots, and then a third one on the right between the dorsolateral folds. It's not uncommon to see 3 or 4 rows, depending on their size, of these spots in between the dorsolateral folds of the leopard frog. On the pickerel frog, however, it's always limited to 2 rows. Also, where the spots on the leopard frog are outlined with a light color, the spots on the pickerel frog are outlined with a dark color. The spots on a leopard frog can be dark brown, but typically black. The dark spots on a pickerel frog are invariably dark brown. You'll recall also that we said that leopard frogs can range from ground color of green to brown, whereas leopard or pickerel frogs are invariably some shade of bronze, tan, or brown. So this is a very typical looking pickerel frog. Now, If we look at the underside of each specimen, there's that creamy white coloration. Also, you see the creamy white coloration on the Rana palustris, the pickerel frog. If this specimen were alive, however, what we would see from about here down the inside of the thigh and also on part of the tibia would be a brilliant yellow washed out color, whereas on the leopard frog that will be absent. We're going to show you a live pickerel frog that has kind of an aberrant color pattern. The live pickerel frog that I'll show you is actually from southeastern Indiana, and all of the spots have fused together to form stripes down its back, but we'll still be able to see some of the other key characteristics for this particular species. The call of the pickerel frog is a deep snore. This pickerel frog, as I described earlier, has spots on its back whose square edges or corners have fused to form these elongated stripes. Aberrant for a pickerel frog, but I've read in literature that this does occur. Notice that the stripes number 2, so you don't have that third row like you oftentimes do with the spots of leopard frogs in between these dorsolateral folds. There are 2 ridges of skin, which may not be easily seen with the camera, and these occur in between the dorsolateral folds, and again the dorsolateral folds extend to here, somewhere on the groin. Now the real key characteristic is that this is a frog that is kind of tan or some shade of bronze with its brown spots, but you can't mistake this for any other frog, and as you can see here, it has extensive flash spots, so that when this frog jumps, it's very easily seen by its predators, but when it lands, the yellow folds away. If we can get it to close its legs, you'll see the yellow has disappeared. So imagine this frog setting in some grass. When it leaps, yellow is seen. When it lands, it disappears, and it's concealed to its predators. Again, this is a frog that lives primarily on land around springs, very cold water. It doesn't go into the water nearly as much as it does stay along the edge, and consequently it has limited webbing on the toes of its hind feet. So this is the pickerel frog. I would also add that if you do collect pickerel frogs, it's a good idea not to put them into the same collection container as other frogs. Noxious secretions from the pickerel frog will very quickly kill other frogs that are contained with it. I keep this frog in an aquarium with a green frog and a leopard frog, and they seem to do fine, but I would never put it into a close container, maybe a Ziploc bag or some kind of plastic container such as this, to transfer it from the field for fear that the noxious secretions from this frog would harm the others. Obviously, they're for protection, and very few animals are known to eat the pickerel frog. However, its name indicates that it's eaten by pickerel, which is a pike-like fish. It's also known to be eaten by bullfrogs, but it has a limited list of predators. One of the things that you may like to take into the field with you would be a field guide to amphibians and reptiles. The one that we most highly recommend is the Peterson Series Field Guide. It's not uncommon to find older editions. This is a 3rd edition. It's not uncommon to find 2nd and 1st. Well, probably not 1st. Let's go back. One of the things that you'll want to take into the field with you is a good field guide, and the one that we most highly recommend is the Peterson Series Field Guide on reptiles and amphibians of the eastern and central North American states. Be careful when you go into bookstores not to get a 2nd edition. There are still some around. I see them frequently on bookshelves. You want to get the 3rd edition with 2 authors, Roger Conant and Joe Collins. If you get one that only has Roger Coney, you'll be getting an outdated version, and the problem is that the scientific names are outdated. The most current scientific names occur in this one. Another problem with people using Peterson series field guides is I've noticed seldom do they know exactly what to do with it. And if you open it up to the frogs and toads, there are plates in the middle. There's text in the beginning. These are primarily reptiles. Amphibian text appears in the last half of the book. And I've turned to plate number 46, which shows chorus frogs. As a matter of fact, it shows 3 of the chorus frogs that we discussed earlier. Here's the western chorus frog. You'll recall that's the one with 3 stripes. The spring peeper with the X. The mountain chorus frog with the triangle between its eyes. And also it has the reverse parentheses. Each of these is described on the opposing page, and if we look at the spring peeper, it says that there's a dark X-shaped mark on its back. The arrow points to that. Also, behind spring peeper, it says M303, which is a map in the back, and page 325. If we turn to page 325, there is a description of the spring peeper with its scientific name. It also refers us back to plate 46. Talks about its size. If we go back to plate 46, you'll notice that it says M303, which we saw earlier. You turn to map 303, and it shows the range of the spring peeper. Now, in Ohio, the range of the spring peeper is contiguous between all borders. But suppose that we were talking about the mountain chorus frog, which you can see up here. It's a smaller map because it has a smaller range. But if you find something that you suspect is a mountain chorus frog and you happen to be looking around Toledo, if you refer to this map, you can see that you're probably misidentifying the frog, and note that you would need to go to one of the other chorus frogs. If you find the frog down here in the southeastern part of the state, then you know that you're well within its range. So don't just use the photo key. Also use the range maps. They can be very helpful. And again, this is a book that you can buy for about $15 at any good bookstore.